Okay, thank you. Well, for anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Kerry Mullen and I'm chair of the Australasian Humour Studies Network Board. So good evening, everyone. I'm really happy to be able to welcome you all to our second AHSN webinar and to see some familiar faces and to meet some new ones as well. I'm going to keep my introduction short as my colleagues Ben, Nicole and Chris Muller will be chairing the event and they're going to introduce the speakers as Ben just explained. But on behalf of the AHSN, I would like to thank Professors Sunden and Parsanen for agreeing to speak to us today, and I apologise for that pronunciation. Thank you for speaking to us today on this really timely and important topic. And I would also like to thank, of course, Ben, Chris and Terry for organising the event and being part of the panel. I'm really looking forward to it. Before I hand over to Ben and Chris, I would just like to say a few words about the AHSN. The network was created by our current convener, Dr. Jessica Milner-Davis, who, as Ben said, will say a few words at the end of the talk. The foundations for the network were actually laid in July 1996, when the International Society for Humour Studies, the ISHS, held its 15th conference on humour and laughter at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. And the success of this gathering was what led Jessica, who was then ISHS president, to propose the establishment of the AHSN, and it was launched the following year. So since then, the network has grown from about 40 members and 10 discipline areas to over 450 scholars and practitioners across more than 25 different disciplines and professions. So we're a smallish but dynamic network, I would say. We have an annual conference and occasional talks and seminars, and we issue regular newsletters as well, which now include full-length book reviews. So we launched this webinar series last year with Professor Limor Schiffman as our inaugural speaker, whom most of you will know, of course, for her seminal work on memes. So we're delighted to be hosting the second webinar with equally eminent speakers in anticipation of our 28th annual conference, which will take place in Hobart, Tasmania, and online very soon from the 2nd to the 4th of Feb. So it just remains for me to put the link to our website in the chat, which I will do, to once again just thank the speakers, the organisers and everyone in the audience for coming, and I'll hand over to Ben and Chris to do the honours.
Thank you very much, Kerry. Really appreciate it. Chris.
Yeah, well, welcome everyone. My name is Chris Muller, as you can see on my ghost profile in the Zoom meeting. I'm based at Macquarie University, and I might just say, so together with Ben and a colleague, Ian Riley, in Mount St. Vincent University in Canada, we've been reading Jenny Sundin and Susanna Passanen's Who's Laughing Now? And this is how this all kind of came together. So it's a real pleasure that this can happen. And I'll just introduce Jenny Sundin. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Jenny Sundin is Professor of Gender Studies at Södertörn University in Stockholm. Her work is situated in the intersection of digital media and technology studies, gender and sexuality studies, feminist and queer theory, and affect theory. She's currently working on queerness and digital intimacy, disconnection and delay, feminist social media tactics that use humor to counter sexism, and the geopolitics of digital sexual cultures across Nordic and Baltic contexts. Sorry.
Chris is doing a bit of ghosting there.
Yeah, I have an echo on my headphones. So, she's the author of Who's Laughing Now? The work we'll learn more about today, which is co-authored with Susanna Passanen, and Gender and Sexuality in Online Game Cultures, a Routledge volume from 2012 with Marlene Svenningsson. Jenny Sundin is currently the principal investigator of two research projects, Digital Sexual Health, designing for safety, pleasure, and well-being in LGBTQ+ communities. This is with Kath Albury and Zara Stardust. And then also rethinking sexuality, a geopolitics of digital sexual cultures in Estonia, Sweden, and Finland, which is a project with Susanna Passanen, Katrin Tiederberg, and Maria Willman. And over to Ben.
Thanks so much. Oh, and it's my pleasure to introduce Susanna Passanen. Susanna Passanen is Professor of Media Studies at University of Turku in Finland, with an interest in studies of sexuality, media, and affect. She's the PI of the consortium Intimacy in Data-Driven Culture, funded by the Strategic Research Council at the Academy of Finland, and author of, for instance, such works as Carnal Resonance, Affect, and Online Pornography at MIT Press, Many Splendid Things, Thinking, Sex, and Play from Goldsmiths Press, and of course, another really important book I would recommend all of you have a read on, Not Suitable for Work, Sex, Humor, and Risk in Social Media, with Kylie Jarrett and Ben Light, also MIT Press, Objectification on the Difference Between Sex and Sexism, with Fiona Atwood, Ellen McKee, John Mercer, and Clarissa Smith, Routledge, and Who's Laughing. Now, of course, the book we're talking about today, Feminist Tactics in Social Media, with Jenny Sunden, MIT Press. And the last one to cite here, Dependent Distracted Bored, Effective Formations in Network Media, also MIT Press. She serves on the editorial boards for instance, organizations such as Sexualities, Porn Studies, New Media and Society, Social Media and Society, and the International Journal of Cultural Studies. Again, thanks so much for making the time to be here with us today. And to our another colleague that I really would like to mention quickly, Terry Sand, from the Macquarie University, also here in Sydney. Thanks very much, all of you, for being here. And over to Jenny and Susanna, it goes.
Well, thank you so much for having us. And what we'll do is Jenny will push all the buttons, and I'll start with kind of a general introduction. So we started working on this book when we didn't know it was going to be a book in 2017. We were interested, we were contributing to a feminist media studies special issue on online misogyny and kind of counter tactics to that. And then we started working on local examples, looking at, well, Swedish and Finnish ones. Push the button, dear, push the button. And one of the things that we became very interested in were forms of resistance to online hate, forms of appropriation in particular. And this is a very direct form of appropriation, and we were told that no foul language is allowed. So it's basically an appropriation of a neo-Nazi kind of paramilitary networks page, Soldiers of Odin. And I could talk about them for a long time, but I will not. So this is an appropriation using runes as this kind of, fake pan-Nordic, let's say, linguistic means, and it says F of Nazis. So we started looking at these kind of forms of appropriation, particularly in reaction to online hate in a political climate that is very much marked by debates on migration, and kind of liberal versus less liberal values, and the rise of the Nazis in particular, since the global, or let's say at least the pan-Nordic refugee crisis of 2015. Now, in the next example, it's a different kind of appropriation that is happening. If you push the button there. But it's basically, it's for Amnesty Finland. It's a design duo called Nati Tarts, a Finnish design duo. And it's a t-shirt that needs a bit of a contextual explanation now. And it was sold at this kind of World's Fair, which is it has a 25-year history. It's basically this kind of multicultural festival in downtown Helsinki every spring. Well, not last spring, obviously, or not in 2020 either, but usually that brings together lots of NGOs, and there's live music and stuff. So I'm sorry, foul language is going to happen because that's what the t-shirt is about. So suvakkihuora in Finnish, tolerance whore. It's a moniker used by the alt-right against women who are excessively and falsely liberal. So basically betraying their race, as they say, by inviting all kinds of people into proximity of the nation and their own bodies. So this is another example of appropriating a label that is meant to injure and shame. And that's why we're working on the Finnish examples in particular that are more straightforward, I would say, appropriations of terminology meant to injure than the Swedish ones in the article. We really became interested in how shame and shamelessness sort of operate, how people respond to attempts at shaming, who can wear a tolerance whore t-shirt under what conditions, who have basically the agency and the space to refuse shame. And this is something that we became, and how that links to sexualization as well. So we became really interested in this. And then around the same autumn, when the Me Too started happening, we figured out that this just might be something that we want to think about further, as in doing a book together, because we just really like working together. That's basically it. So in the book, and if you'll click forward, dear, one of the themes that runs through the book, and there are many, so it deals with affect, but in particular, the dynamics of shame, shaming, shamelessness, embarrassment, cringe, and how that all links to forms of laughter, sometimes forms of humor as well. But basically, who takes on the label of shamelessness, who is being shamed. And one of the examples we discuss is Stormy Daniels, who in particular, before she became kind of a parapsychic ghost hunter, which seems to be her current profession, she was very much geared towards doing Twitter burns against all the hate after her exposés about then President Donald Trump. So there was a lot of hate, and she would do these very kind of like sharp burns throughout the day, refusing to be shamed by people calling her sluts. She would basically respond by, complaining that she's not being appreciated for the quality of the slut that she is. Like this complete refusal to play with the rules. And as we started focusing more on the refusal to play, following any rules, preset rules, we became interested in absurdity. Maybe the next example would be a good one. And as we were working on this around the Me Too, basically from the beginning of Me Too, and that might seem like an example where there's not much to laugh about, like one of those examples of kind of online organization that is very much driven by a different affective register of rage, of fury, of sadness, of grief, that then mobilizes both individual and collective bodies into social action. But again, we really kept on focusing on the dynamics of shame and shaming. And of course, one basic dynamic of Me Too is to shift the label of shame from the victims of sexual violence to the perpetrators. But then it sort of went, as happens, it went overboard because the logic in the US in particular of the sex scandal. So, what Harvey Weinstein's penis looked like. Did he ejaculate to a potted plant or not? Like these details that would not really be significant in terms of the ethics or the power differentials or the politics of any of this. So it became this example where the dynamics of shame and ridicule really started fixating on certain bodies, outed as and othered as monstrous, which is paradoxical given that Me Too's basic kind of dynamic is to point out the ubiquity and the kind of very, very mundane, ordinary quality of sexual violence and harassment. And actually something else happened here. And in the next example, it's the same dynamic in the meme culture against Harvey Weinstein. And here we did kind of a comparative, not really comparative study. What we also addressed Swedish examples that operate quite differently. when it comes to humor and when it comes to shaming and the whole absence of the sex scandal. But through Me Too and through the examples that we started looking at, we really started focusing on absurd as this moment of refusing to play by the rules, of starting from some place completely different. And there are many ways that the absurdity operates here. On the one hand, it can be this disclaimer, as in this is absurd. So it's a diagnosis of the state of affairs in the world, basically. And then it's also a tactic of refusing this set logic by taking things somewhere else, refusing to make sense, at least refusing to make sense following the same logic that is being offered. Click, please. Yeah. And then that led us to an explanation. I'm not really doing a systematic overview of the book because I don't think that's really, and it will soon over to Jenny. But we started looking at these examples of absurdity, and in particular, our focus throughout the book is really on kind of like the mainstream success stories, so to speak, of feminist humor online and in social media, and then that sets limits to what those examples are. They are very, very white. They are very, very much concerned with binary gender and let's say heterosexuality, the dynamics of heterosexuality. And of course, this is something that we can talk about further. So one of the logics in which absurdity creeps in is through a very simple tactic of reversal. So The Man Who Has It All, which is a Twitter, Facebook project, basically plays with gender reversal, kind of borrowing the language of women's magazines to talk about male bodies. And it's a fictitious account by a working dad. And the next example is, I think, the last one of mine, which is from the same one. And this is an appropriation of Goop, the lifestyle brand that got a little bit of bad press years ago when they suggested the vaginal steaming, that you should put herbs and chilies in a pot and then, boil the thing and squat over it for some kind of inner renewal. It's always been a bit of a mystery what was supposed to happen. So in this logic of reversal and switch, trying to point out the absurdity of things, but then of course what happens here is also a bit more, because it opens up into this social theater in the comments and in the discussion streams. So it becomes almost this parallel universe of followers who've been at this for a while, to jump in, to elaborate, and also to coin these kind of alternative worlds where people do penis steaming. Over to you, darling.
All right. I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive, let's say, into the Tumblr blog. Congrats, you have an all-male panel, which, in case you've missed it, it has a very straightforward rationale. It consists of photos of all male panels with, as you can see, the additional visual pleasure of a small picture of David Hasselhoff from the 1980s Knight Rider era, lifting his thumb up in this gesture of approval, sort of congratulating the male panels on a job well done in the name of male dominance. So, well, here they are joining efforts for breastfeeding. Congrats, you have an all-male panel, then assembles together seemingly endless images of panels, firmly male, whether these focus on, well, anything, electoral policies, the military, gender equality, as you can see here, abortion or reproductive rights. So visual repetition and obviously irony make for an absurd feminist reverb, we think, similar to what Alexander Shu, in the context of queer Tumblr, identifies as this form of temporal intensity of repeat and repeat. So the further down you scroll in this archive of all male panels, the more the male panel participants start to look both uncongenial, out of place, hilarious, and yes, just plain absurd. So as with many other feminist social media initiatives that we address in the book, congrats, you have an all-male panel then, as Susanna said, it operates with the effective registers of shame. But more specifically, the type of shame operative in this Tumblr entails embarrassment then over being called out for having put together or having participated in yet another all-male panel, and then being complicit in the reproduction of gender discrimination and exclusion. So compared to shame more generally, the dynamics of embarrassment, well, it involved less affective intensity, or it's a different kind of intensity. So for someone like Irving Goffman, which is not your regular feminist theorist, writing this in the 50s, so it's a fresh reference, embarrassment is densely social, he says. It's always present in human encounters, threatening to turn social comfort into awkward discomfort, or in his terms, discomfiture. So that moves from the intensity of abrupt embarrassment to sort of a more sustained uneasiness of barely apparent flusterings. It's pretty beautiful, this writing, we find. So at the same time, it does entail stickiness and mirroring similar to those of shame. I mean, it's not always the case that the one and the same person is both the cause of embarrassing social dissonance, the one for whom things are embarrassing, and the one for whom the embarrassment is felt. So a person then might fail to feel appropriately embarrassed, and others may blush for him instead. So this is why embarrassment seems to be contagious, Goffman says, spreading once started in evening wider circles of discomfiture. So due then to this contagious nature of embarrassment, it threatens to spill over onto those pointing out the embarrassing behavior. So in this case, onto everybody contributing to this steadily growing Tumblr. So Goffman points out that embarrassment, it's about unfulfilled expectations. So being the one causing the embarrassment can be embarrassing in and of itself. So the one bringing attention to something embarrassing is the one who also disrupts the social comfort for others. So this effective dynamic then fuels feminist tactics that make use of embarrassment and the social shaming this entails. So pointing out an injustice disturbs the fun of others. They seem to have a lot of fun still. I mean, in this case, the fun in constantly being in the company of other men who perhaps up until this point have been unaware that there was something problematic there. So congrats, you have an all-male panel. We think it can be thought of as a form of feminist cringe comedy, really, that creates sociability among those not only engaged in embarrassing others, but also among those cringing on behalf of those who ought to be embarrassed. So the plain absurdity of all-male panels and their clear cringe qualities, then it operates as an effective glue that joins together followers to express bemusement, embarrassment, or even pity for this long line of men gathered around rectangular tables to discuss things that matter. A particularly cringeworthy tweet that we found reads, so congrats to so-and-so for first responding to criticism of their manels by actually adding a woman to each of them, and then complaining about it at the event. Job well done. As Susanna already pointed out, so we're in the book, we're particularly attracted to absurd forms of feminist humor, something which we see traffic in the unreasonable, the illogical, the inappropriate. So if we go to someone like Will Noonan, so he would argue that absurdist humor then is often understood to be split in two. So you have rational or logical absurdism and the lighthearted playfulness on the one hand, if we think of Lewis Carroll, for example, and then we have existential absurdism with a much darker bend on the other, if we think of Albert Camus and the post-war theater of the absurd. So defining humor is notoriously risky, and we try to stay clear of too neat taxonomies. But we find in our examples of feminist absurdism a compound of the lighthearted and the darkly existential. So the utmost absurd or surreal qualities of sexism then provide a sounding board for seemingly lighter forms of humor that combine the illogical with the indecent. Trying not to use foul language in this section. So feminist absurdist humor has lightness to it, yet remains grounded in something considerably heavier. So this is then a paradox that forms a tactic for actually dealing with a ludicrous reality. So this is an example from Stephanie Sarli. She's an artist and she does, let's say, 21st century cunt art, on Instagram. But I'm going to give you some male panels following this repeat logic. So the critical and feminist value of humor has to do with, we think, of course, it's critical edge that is connected to questioning, to critique, but also with the effective lifts and spaces of ambiguity precisely that it allows for. So when absurdity that regularly intermesh with irony and parody, so when absurdity enters the picture, a space is opened up for effective ambiguity of different kinds. Addressing ambiguity and absurdity precisely, Simone de Beauvoir argues for the importance of telling them or keeping them apart, so that the notion of ambiguity is not confused with that of absurdity. So she says to declare that existence is absurd is to deny that it can ever be given meaning. And then she says to say that it's ambiguous is to assert that its meaning is never fixed, that it must constantly be won. So for someone like de Beauvoir, ambiguity then is about the multiplicity of meanings of life itself, of existence, while the absurd then denies meaning as such in a much more abrupt sense. So our argument, again, is for understanding absurdity as a feminist tactic that is fueled by ambiguity. Because we think that, to critically examine culture and society, it's necessary to acknowledge incompatible differences and then to work with and through tensions that may just refuse to be resolved. So this is also very much the case with feminist movements, to work with and through tensions that may refuse to be resolved, right? So while absurd humor, much like feminist activism, may begin then from this site of anger that Susanna pointed out, reactivity, negative evaluation, it need not remain confined by it. So then by turning things preposterous, ludicrous, or inappropriate, absurd laughter ends up somewhere different. So as a feminist tactic, absurd humor, it points to the absurdity of social norms that regulate gender and sexuality as being ridiculously unreasonable. So refusing then the current state of affairs, this tactic, it foregrounds effective ambiguity and embraces the possibilities of sensing and making sense of the world differently. So this is why we think this is a good place to start, or maybe for today, it's a good place to end. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for writing this book. It helped me unravel a lot of things that in places where I wouldn't normally expect them. So I'll give you an example. I've been doing a lot of public health stuff. You guys know this. And one of the things that we sort of get asked by public health people once they realize, like, the kids like the memes today, is, well, why don't we just put all our public health language in the language of a meme? And then the kids will like that. And trying to explain, there was a thing underlined in the intro to your book that I'm sure it's not new for the humor studies people, but the notion that you can make taxonomies where irony sits over here and parody sits over here and ambiguity sits over here and they don't ever touch. This is precisely what needs to get rethought, I think, in this political moment. It's not enough to just say, well, different audiences experience things differently, because there's lived effects of those experiencing differently. So when you have a meme that is making fun of people who spread medical misinformation, and you think, oh, that's very clever, and then it gets taken up as legitimate medical information by someone in a different part of the world, there needs to be a way to have a conversation about the limits of a particular kind of ironic stance. And I think that I really like the way, particularly Jenny, the way that you framed what's going on in a feminist context as a sort of a temporal snapshot, that this is where we are now. And these are the tactics with what we are dealing with. So I guess the question that I would have for both of you were there case studies when you were looking through your stuff? Were there things that you said, this one is so messy that we can't even figure out how to put it in this conversation right now?
Maybe I can start. I think we wanted messier. I mean, Susanna, maybe I'm forgetting something that we put aside because it was too much to take on, but really, I mean, and like Susanna said, in looking at really sort of successful feminist initiatives, these are pretty, they are not so wild or queer or messy in that kind of a way. So we had to work with, you know, we had to think long and hard about the allure of gender binaries, precisely, because we felt that we were sort of sucked into that and we got stuck in that binary logic. But then, so we had to think about what's the why the popularity, you know, must have a reason, because it has resonance in, I mean, so you can bring together a very diverse crowd that would have sort of similar experiences still on a scale, but still sort of similar experiences with sexism. Mm-hmm. But sexism, again, white sexism. I
mean, as I was listening to you guys, I was thinking, this is so super selfish, so sorry for dominating the panel, but I have one case that all I want you to do is write about it. And it is Nicki Minaj's cousin's balls. And the ramifications for public health were freaking insane. I'm sitting there on this WHO, you know, listserv, and people are saying, you think it's a joke, but, you know, half of Trinidad and Tobago had to like stop taking care of people because we had to keep having all of these press conferences. And then people outside CDC were saying, guess what? There's a demonstration. about Nicki Minaj's cousin's balls. But when you dug, maybe the wrong term, when you dug into that, what you start to see is, at least for the demonstrations, it was part of a political resistance. It was mostly African Americans. It was people saying, CDC never does right by our community. You guys have a long history of just ignoring us or telling us any goddamn thing. Sorry with the cursing. And when are we going to be able to have a conversation? So having that weird moment where you had, it was absurd, this crazy comment, and then people were joking about it, and then people were saying, it's not as funny as you think, on all kinds of different sides. For me, this did wind up in this sort of race, and then people saying, that's not why his balls are the way they are, right? And so then that becomes a whole conversation about, he was supposed to get married, so it was about monogamy and non-monogamy. So I think that's why I was asking, were there any things that had jumped out at you? Obviously, Nicki Minaj's cousin's balls had not happened while you were publishing, but are there any other things that have come up even lately that you're like, what do we even do with this?
Well, I'm sort of seconding Jenny. I mean, it's part of our kind of methodology of how we sampled the stuff that we write about, that sets certain limits to it, obviously, like what happens there. But I think, I mean, very much what you're talking about, it links back to the point of ambiguity, and not just like ambivalence, like, I have mixed feelings about this, or relativism, as it, it sort of depends. Because if you think of ambiguity as really this kind of like irreconcilable tensions, the fact that the one and the same thing is multiple things at the same time for different people, it can have very different effects at the very same moment. So let's say data capitalism does horrible things to the environment, to sociability, to politics, and then it does something, and then it also does something very important for sociability, for different kinds of cultures. And unless we hold on to these both simultaneous developments, then we're not going to see the whole picture. And I think that's a big challenge for cultural analysis. This is more expansive an argument, that very often, in order to come up with like a reading or an argument, we really flatten out these kinds of tensions that refuse to be resolved. And there's a lot of analytical violence. And then there's a risk of scholarship feeding into this kind of soundbite economy of social media. And I mean, in my other work, I've been very concerned with how this kind of like, critical internet research that says like, oh, apps are designed to make us unhappy, they kill sociability. They basically operate with the logic of the soundbite, which is the logic of the social economy in terms of the length of the argument, in terms of the simplification. And I think that's something very toxic. So we want it messier, as Jenny said, definitely. And while some of the examples are complex, some of them are not that complex. Yeah. But then again, we didn't really look at memes because we really couldn't find memes that would sort of make sense in terms of how we sampled the material. And with memes, of course, because a meme is it's also a singular thing is not a meme. A meme is something that is a part of a series. And when something is part of a series, it's going to be about variation. It's going to be about conflicting meaning. It's going to be about, turning things around expansively. So yes, I can fully understand why you would be hesitant to recommend that as a public health approach. That would be, it comes with a certain degree of risk.
And on that note of risk, which is a very interesting topic, I was just going to say, Justine, if you might risk it. So Justine was nice enough to say I'm being recorded for the question and had her hands up waiting patiently. Justine, floor is yours, your question, please.
Oh, hi. great to see everybody. Jessica and Kerry and everybody, I'll miss you in Hobart next week. Thank you, Susanna and Jenny. That was so interesting. I can't wait to get your book. I just want to ask, the idea of shame and shameful and shameless, did you follow anything, say with the boards, you know, no women on panels, that kind of thing? Did you see anything or follow anything where you saw a radical change because of the humour, like the effect of social humour for change? As a, you know, did anything happen? Did you look at that? Like, for example, you probably followed a Twitter account in Melbourne. There's a room in Melbourne that very rarely has women on the bill, and there's a Twitter account that calls out no women on the bill. I think it's called something like that. I couldn't see any change on the bill at any time, but I wondered, did you see anything change? Was that part of the research?
Well, I mean, you mentioned all male panels because, I mean, that's the one that perhaps most clearly actually made things shift, because it became something of a household word in academic circles. So, and I mean, way beyond gender studies, let's say. So various men participating in panels became aware of it being a problem. So some also taking a pledge that they would never ever do it and things like that. So, and we think, I mean, so there were similar initiatives around the same time, 2015-ish, but the humor, so the punchiness of all male panels, the Tumblr blog, made that one sort of stand out. It had a different sort of effective vibrancy to it that made it successful and also got the message across. In our other examples, even if these initiatives may be sort of in the moment and gaining a momentum, it also sort of quickly might die. So social change is it's a slower process. So we don't know, it's hard to say if it actually made a change, but I mean, it does, I think it makes a difference in the moment. And so, but who knows how to measure that or to say if it made something shift long-term. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, many of these are basically, I mean, the stuff like there's one by a Swedish handball player and social activist, Linnea Claesson. That's a very local example, but very, I mean, big in the local context. So many of these are, and basically she's calling out hate, harassment. I mean, both kind of like sexual harassment and then the kind of outright hostility. And basically with the visibility that her Instagram account has, it sheds light into something and it brings things into public discussion in one shape or form. Of course, it also makes her more subject to more hate. So there's that logic as well. But I think with any kind of social media initiative, partly because we've been looking at the stuff that has gained the attention, has brought things into certain kind of light, at least they open up like a space for paying attention and naming something. How then that leads to social change. I mean, it's like, you know, with Me Too, how people are saying like, oh, did it change anything really? Which might not really be the question to ask. And it's actually what Zizi Papakarisi argued years ago, that the speed of social media, I mean, the speed with which we become kind of, you know, excited or horrified or enraged, and how the kind of passions fly as hashtags are circulated with huge kind of speed. It's not really compatible with the logic and speed of social change. Like if you want to drive for, you know, legal legal changes or anything like that, that's going to take years. And if it's kind of rage that drives many social media initiatives, it also wears these bodies down. So one of the reasons we've been really gravitating towards humor is that it affords these effective lifts that then make life more livable. even if working with something pretty heavy as happens in something like Me Too. And then that can be a bridge towards having the kind of tenacity that is required for the social body, in a sense, to change. So following John Protevi, I mean, the kind of the speed with which individual, like somatically, we become engaged with something, and then how that happens on a group level, that can be pretty speedy. But then the social transformation is a thing of its own. And I think with something like with Me Too, we are in between those things, the kind of group level and then the social level. Or maybe that's always going to be the case though.
My question kind of follows on just from this. So I was really fascinated in your book, the way you used shame, and I like the way you conceptualized it and try to kind of, I think a lot of your argument, if I phrase it correctly, was also interested in the way that this humor could generate certain communities and like certain groups. And the moment that these groups were kind of regulated in certain ways, it would generate a different kind of humor because it wasn't quite as public and it wasn't quite as perhaps risky for people to contribute to that the debate. So I'm just interested in how you see those kind of, what we actually learn about shame perhaps through this kind of humor and the way it manifests and travels, because I guess usually, I mean, I've got an interest in shame myself, but often like shame manifests by not manifesting, by staying silent, by like never becoming visible, and by kind of, so there seems to be something kind of paradoxical that you have these very viral content about very hard topics, but at the same time, it's pointing to this much bigger kind of social reality that is very unspoken and not spoken about. So I was just kind of hoping to hear a bit more about your thoughts on shame and how you're conceptualizing it in this technological space. So I hope that makes sense as a kind of a comment question.
Yeah, well, I can start and just say that when we started this work, we thought that we were going to work on online hate, and how online hate is not only something that is is intended to make people afraid, to frighten, to scare, but also to shame. That a lot of sort of online hate is in the register of body shaming and sexual shame and that kind of shaming dynamics, which made us interested in. Because I mean that's a pretty heavy project, and so to sustain that kind of work, we got interested in what happened when people sort of took that experience and how it resonated in their experiences of having been shamed or being shamed, and sort of turning that around somehow. So one of those sort of points of transformation was, so this is one of our Swedish examples. So it's called, it was a Facebook event. It was very underground, but it exploded during just a matter of weeks. It was called, so in Swedish, skamlös utsläckning, so shameless extinction. So it was all about this upside down world of sort of women behaving as men. So the shameless hag was sort of the portal figure of this movement. So that made us interested in not only shaming, but also shamelessness, and how behaving shamelessly never gets rid of shame, but it can play with it, and it does things to it, which makes it sort of more livable in a way. But so that was how it started, I think, and then it developed from there.
Yeah, and in those examples, the Finnish ones, which are largely, they are reactive as kind of resistance towards labels that are intended to hurt. There's an interesting dynamic, and we're definitely not the first ones to explore it, where people are accused of being Nazis, feel they are being, who actively shame people, like calling them suvakkihuora, which is the Finnish term which I mean, in Swedish context, makes no sense. So we had a whole discussion about like overtly tolerant whore, like what does that even mean? It's very contextually bound. So people using this term for race traitors, as they call it, are then, they feel then insulted that they are being shamed for being Nazis. So it's like this endless recircling of shame. As Jenny said, there's no doing away with shame. It just becomes kind of like rerouted. And this kind of attempts at counter shaming or kind of embarrassing, they are not necessarily like success stories. Like the manual has been a success story because it's in a context of expertise, you know, who gets to speak in conferences, in symposia. It's a very particular, it's a concern for particular groups of people. But when it comes to these attempts to refuse shame, let's say in anti-racist activities in the Nordic countries, there is no necessarily happy end to it. It might just fuel more rage, actually, even if there's humor involved. So it's kind of an explosive dynamic, actually. So, I mean, there's very much kind of like stickiness and something lingering to shame. And definitely when we started working on this book, we didn't think that shame, I mean, well, we didn't know that we were doing a book on humor to start with. And no, it was really the hate. And then we didn't really know that we would be that focused on shame. And in particular, we deal a lot with sexuality and shame in the book and how those become rerouted. And then what happens when people get shameless. The shameless sluts, we are really interested in those. Not sure I'm answering your question.
Oh, Chris.
No, I think, yeah, it's helpful. The rerouting, I think, was, for me, it's very interesting to me how you're kind of conceptualizing that. What was fascinating about the book, that you were always thinking about very particular instances of shame that become kind of involved in much wider circulations and movement and generating meaning all along. So it's kind of, I just thought it was a very inspiring reading of how affect or something so specific, shame has such a specific value when we experience it. It's so like it pinpoints us so strongly as individuals, but you like just show how well like it connects into kind of social meaning and these kind of texts that emerge from it. So I think your examples really kind of reiterated that movement. So yeah, that's right. Thanks.
I mean, because it's always about specific encounters. I mean, if the experience of shame is a sense of kind of failure, of having failed either in your own eyes or in the eyes of society, eyes of others, or like an abstract entity such as a god, basically you failed in the face of someone who you want to accept you. You desire, I mean, Tompkins' idea that shame is always about proximity denied. It's about desire for closeness, for contact that becomes severed through kind of failure. Then of course, I mean, being shamed by a Nazi, I mean, unless you really want that Nazi to embrace you or accept you, so it really is about these relations of like what kinds of proximities are desired, what kind of contact is desired. And clearly not all contact is desired, but then it also becomes very clearly about questions of privilege. I mean, right. In the very first examples that we started out with, they are really about social hierarchies.
Yeah. No, I was thinking of that, how it's also about the proximity to various norms that regulate bodies differently, right? So while we're building on Tompkins, we're also building here on someone like Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick and how she would think about sort of shame-prone identities and how we're not all equal in the face of shame, right?
All right. Just one very last question, if I may, because I'm really interested, because it's just fantastic the things you bring up here. And this goes to more like the risk and community formation things. I'm working on Holocaust comedy and Hitler humor for a long time now, and I'm wondering, so what kind of reactions have you encountered, Jenny and Susanna, working on this, publishing the book? from the scholarly community, and like what's the reactions there, like working on this the taboo space and with that kind of feminist tactics. What was, if you can talk about it, I mean, because I find it a very interesting way positioning yourself as that kind of, you said you would have written this book about hate, but you wrote it about the laughter about hate. So I was just wondering if you could maybe comment on that, because I find it so, the reactions are like, it's so interesting what kind of things you get as the person writing about it. And then we go to the audience questions in a moment.
Yeah, so publishing in the midst of the pandemic is not ideal. You can't do the book tour or you can still do book talks like we do, but I mean, there has been some reactions, sort of kind ones from sort of fellow feminist queer scholars, but not a lot from humor studies people, and we're not sure why. I mean, they some of them come to our events, but they don't speak to us. So we're not sure how it's being sort of picked up or read by people who are invested in humor studies and laughter.
It's the perfect venue for this. All I can say about
that,
which is why we're so grateful.
So we're super happy to be here, but we thought maybe it was going to be sort of picked up a little sooner, or by other humor studies people.
Super interesting. I'm sorry, Susanna, if you'd like to add, because I find this, sorry, but I'm not going to hog on the time. When we go into the audience, but stop the record. To me, it's one of the fascinating, like, why don't you talk amongst the disciplines about these things? There's obviously so much, like fertile ground to cover there.
Yeah, I mean, basically, we've been doing seminars, like queer seminars and gender studies seminars in terms of the talks. I mean, we did do like a book launchy thing. And then there's also a fair amount of research in Finland around populism, kind of alt-right politics and populism. So I also did a talk with them. But then again, they would be very much in line. And we cite many of these people because they really write about a lot about gender-based shaming and hate, and about Nazi humor. I mean, there's kind of a body of literature on different Nordic contexts and forms of alt-right humor. So that's one framework, but it is, I mean, as Jenny said, in one of a couple of actually the Swedish seminars that we did, the people who are humor scholars did show up, but they didn't say anything. I did a keynote recently for the Finnish Cultural Studies Association, and I was talking about excitement and ambiguity, the kind of affected ambiguity more generally. And I think I managed somehow offending the one humor studies person present. She really didn't like it. I don't know, because I wasn't really, I think it was about me pointing out the problem with the taxonomical thinking, that's not always the starting point. Because I mean, just because absurd sort of messes, I think, with that logic. So I think the taxonomical interest maybe offended her.